Starting a new book today, The Linguistic Wars, Chomsky, Lakoff, and the Battle Over Deep Structure by Randy Allen Harris, second edition. Now, I've actually already read the first edition. So this is the second edition. This over here is the first edition. You can see the covers are much different. This one looks much nicer, much glossier. Comparing the front and back, certainly a lot more colorful. You can also see this second edition here is much bigger than the first edition. It looks like there's a bit more meat on it. So, yeah, the first edition of this book I read about 2 years ago now, I think, and reviewed it on this channel. And I'll leave a link in the description down below to my review of the first edition of this book. So I suppose I should talk about why I've chosen to read the second edition of this book after having already read the first edition of this book. But before I do that, I should probably back up and give some background on this, because it's quite possible there are people watching this video who don't know who Chomsky is. I mean, it's possible. Chomsky is very well known in certain circles, leftist politics and linguistics, but outside of those circles, I think he's largely unknown. So for anyone who doesn't know who Chomsky is, he's a very famous linguist who is famous for pretty much single-handedly upending the field of linguistics in the late 1950s or 1960s and starting a whole new school of linguistics. And also has a reputation for being very combative in linguistics, which is where the linguistic wars comes in here. He's got a lot of fights he's picked over his career. But what's interesting about Chomsky, what makes him a really fascinating figure, is he has two careers. One is as a linguistics scholar, but the other one is as a political commentator. And he rose to prominence as a political commentator again in the 1960s as a critic of the Vietnam War. But as the Vietnam War ended, he continued to be a critic of U.S. foreign policy in Central America and Indonesia and various other places. The Iraq War, of course, the Middle East. I mean, he's still alive. He's in his 90s, but he's still alive and commenting on U.S. foreign policy now. And I think he's largely retired from linguistics, but yeah. So he's if you've ever listened to him, he's a fascinating person to listen to, because he seems to have at his command just instant recall of everything he's ever read or listened to. There's a quote about him that I believe appeared in the documentary Manufacturing Consent. I could be wrong about where this quote is from, but it says, Chomsky gives the impression about having read everything there is to read, having listened to everything, and being able to remember it. Now, whether or not that's actually what he's doing or whether he's just very good at giving that impression is, I guess, something people can debate. But certainly he has a very authoritative air if you listen to him speak. And for people who are predisposed to leftist politics, he's a cult figure in those circles. And I should know because I was in those circles for a long time. I fell under Chomsky's spell in college. I was doing a history paper on the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And one of my professors recommended that I read Chomsky for the paper. He said, if you're going to write about the U.S. media in Central America, you need to read Chomsky. and this was even at a conservative Christian college, no less. But he was one of the more liberal professors at that college. Yeah, and I was already predisposed to leftist politics at that time, but hadn't heard about Chomsky. I don't know why. I guess just because I don't read as much as I should. But once I started reading Chomsky, I was very impressed and I idolized him. I was fully in the cult of Chomsky. Um, I haven't. I do have to confess, I haven't read very many of his books at all, cover to cover. I think only a couple, and then there's a couple more that I've skimmed through or started but never finished. But Chomsky is just as famous for his speeches as he is for his writings. And even before the age of YouTube, you could find his videos of his speeches or audio recordings of his speeches in the library, or they'd be passed around in leftist or activist circles. But of course, now with the internet and YouTube, there's just tons of, you can find so many of his interviews and talks and speeches. The further back in time you go, the harder it is to find. There are some recordings of his 1960s speeches. They appear to be a little bit thin on the ground in YouTube, at least that's my impression. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong places. But so suffice it to say, he has a cult of personality in leftist politics, and I definitely got sucked into that in my youth. And by youth, I mean all of my 20s and 30s. Now that I'm in my 40s, I feel like I've come out the other side of that. Not that I've completely disavowed him, but I feel like I'm past the age where you idolize people. I just have a much more cynical view of everybody, including Chomsky. I think that's normal with age, and I don't know. Maybe the first edition of the Linguistic War helped me to make that transition, because it presents Chomsky with all of his talents, but also with all of his faults. And I'm given to understand that the second edition is even harder on him in some aspects, although I haven't quite started it yet. So that's my history with Chomsky's politics. Now, my history with Chomsky's linguistics. I have been, for my entire adult life, teaching English in Asia. And as part of that career, I have occasionally gone back to school for qualifications. The CELTA, the Delta, a master's degree in applied linguistics. Now, applied linguistics, but applied linguistics with a TESOL emphasis, excuse me, which is, if you're at all familiar with the field, you recognize this as not a hard-hitting linguistics degree. It's just basically about the teaching and learning of languages. It is not about structural linguistics. But Chomsky was definitely a name that came up in that course. And because I was already enthralled with Chomsky because of my politics, I was interested. Because of my politics, and also because I was totally in his cult of personality. I was interested in learning more about his linguistic work, just to get a fuller picture of him. And in my degree, Chomsky was something. It was never somebody that we studied in depth, but he was always somebody who was name checked in applied linguistics. People were familiar with his name. They were familiar with the theories associated with him, but we did not really get into depth in it. I have tried over the years to get into depth in it, and have, yeah, this is Chomsky's Universal Grammar, which I had on my shelves for about 10 years and finally read a couple years ago. And this was a really tough realization to come to, but this book just completely defeated me. I did my best. I read the whole thing from cover to cover. I tried to make notes in the margins, but quite often my notes just consisted of don't understand, read this paragraph multiple times, headache. These are the extents of my notes here. I really tried my best, but this stuff is just beyond me. My sister, who's much smarter than I am and studied linguistic anthropology and taught linguistics for a while actually at the university level, recommended this book to me. And she said that it was easy to understand, and it gave the history of the Chomskyan Revolution, and also the Linguistic Wars, which is the story of Chomsky's the younger generation of linguists who are coming up in the late 1960s, who wanted to make a name for themselves, and wanted to advance their own models of grammar and vocabulary. Sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? Semantics. Sorry, their own models of grammar and semantics. And Chomsky came down on them hard, either because they were wrong or because Chomsky just really wanted to protect his own model. And that was the basis of the linguistic wars. So my sister recommended this book for me. I special ordered it from a bookstore when I was back in the United States, back in, I forget, 2018, 2017. And I read it and have similar notes here. Look at my notes here. I've largely given up trying to understand several pages ago. So once again, this was a book that just defeated me. And yet, despite this book just being above my comprehension level, and again, this is another book that I really did my best with, but I just couldn't understand the technical parts of it. In spite of that, I found it absolutely fascinating. Not the parts I couldn't understand, obviously, because I couldn't understand them, but just the whole narrative about, because it's partly a linguistic textbook and it's partly a narrative history, given the history of Chomsky's revolution, how he upended the linguistics department, and then how these younger linguistics guys came in and the battles between them, and the Vietnam War was all going on in the background, and Chomsky, it was all really interesting, the politics of it, because Chomsky was like the preeminent critic of the Vietnam War, and these guys hated Chomsky, but they admired his political work. So the contradictions that brought about. So the whole narrative part of it, and the personality conflict of it, I found really fascinating. So I reviewed it on this YouTube channel, and I also wrote up a written review on my blog. Pardon the mess in this apartment. I'm going to go over, change views here to the blog, where I was at the time in the habit of writing long reviews of everything I've read. This was before we had the second baby. I could not write this again now. I just do not have the time to write this again now. But yeah, and even back then, this is, I don't know, and the YouTube video is linked into the review. So posted this on the blog and got a comment from none other than the author himself. And I'm just going to read this out. I've asked Randy Allen Harris about this, and he says it's okay to reference this comment. I mean, it's public on the blog anyways, but I did double check it with him. And he says, "Thank you so much for this review. It's a great kindness for an author to see their work examined with such care and detail by smart and curious readers." Well, thank you very much, sir. I only wish the timing was a bit different, since I have a second edition coming out in a few weeks. Now, I had no idea there was a second edition coming out when I read this, but yeah, such is the timing. It was already with the press by the time you posted this review, let alone when I saw it just now. This is September 19, 2021, about, I don't know, 4 months after I posted it. But it would have been helpful if I had been able to work from your comments in redrafting it. I think you get at some of, I think I did get at some of your concerns, however, though one never knows, and I retained most of what you enjoyed. Please thank your sister for her kind words to you about the book. I wrote that whole thing up in the book review. And for prodding you to read it. All the very best, Randy. Now, I have been keeping this book blog since 2006, and I never hear from the authors. There was one other case when an author left a note, but just one other case in all those years. Now, so when an author goes through the trouble of writing that, I'm quite pleased, and especially because, for all the frustrations that this book gave me, I'd spent weeks reading it, kind of weeks where you're inside the author's head, or he's inside yours, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it, where you're just spending all these hours with the author, reading through their ideas as they're guiding you through stuff. And then to make that kind of human connection, I thought was really neat. I really appreciated that comment. And I don't know, I guess you could make the case that authors shouldn't interact with their critics. I know Steve Donahue on his BookTube channel has talked about this, but then I'm not a professional critic. It's a blog. Nobody pays me anything for this. And, it was, I'll leave a link to this in the description. It was a mixed review. I did not hold back my thoughts about the parts I thought that were not explained well, or the parts that I couldn't understand. There were positives in it as well, but it was definitely mixed. So that's it's a really good sport of him to take that in stride, I thought. So I thanked him, and then he messaged a bit later. Have you had the interest or time to check out the second edition? So the second edition's out. He's asking me if I've read it. Now, to be perfectly honest, I was not planning on reading the second edition prior to this. The way I looked at it is I had struggled through this and only partly understood it. I had struggled through this and only partly understood it, and I thought, okay, I'm just done. I'm gonna keep reading books about language for my own career as an English teacher, but I'm going to read kind of pedagogical grammars. I'm not going to attempt to get into Chomskyan structural grammar. I had been thinking, but then when he went through the trouble of asking me if I wanted to read the second edition, personally checking in with me, I thought, okay, yeah, sure. I said, yeah, okay, I'd be interested to check it out. The problem is I'm living out here in Vietnam, blah, 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 blah. So getting books, particular books, is an issue. But whenever I go back to visit America, I load up on books. And I'll put on my list of books to buy next time stateside. Now, I was honestly planning on getting this book the next time I was back in the States. The problem is, because of various things, wife and kids and stuff like that, it's more difficult for me to get back to the States than it used to be. So I haven't been back to the States for a few years now, and at the moment don't know when I'll next make the next trip. So I was planning on ordering the book when I was back in the States. And you can actually get books delivered to Vietnam. Some of my colleagues do it, but I've never messed with trying to. I don't have a credit card. It gets complicated. So I was just going to pick it up back when I was back in the States. But then Randy Allen Harris contacted me again, and again I've asked him if it's okay to disclose this, and he said it was. So I'm not breaking any confidences here. He offered to send me out a copy. Now my parents were visiting here in December, so the way we worked it out is he sent a copy to my parents, and they brought it out to Vietnam with them when they came in December. It's the end of March now, so it's been sitting on my shelf for a few months now. I had some other reading projects I needed to clear out before I was ready to tackle this. But yeah, I'm ready to tackle this now. I have in the months that this has been sitting in my shelf, I have flipped through it. Particularly the last chapter, chapter 10, Chomsky Agonistes, and found it fascinating to read through. I don't think I read the whole thing, but was this last chapter here is was not in the first edition, and was really interesting. Reading that last chapter, sometimes you do this, right? Especially with a nonfiction book, especially a book that you know that you will read cover to cover at some point. You sometimes will skip around when you're previewing it. I've done that a bit. The other thing that caught my eye is a lot of the graphics in here. Would you call them graphics or graphs? A lot of them seem to be new or different than in the first edition. So we'll see how much this compares with the stuff that was in the first edition. It is very possible that there will be large parts of this book I don't understand, as was true of this book and of this book. And if that happens again, I'm just going to power through. We'll make a note of it. But I'll report back during my weekly reading vlogs about my progress on this book. And then I'll do a final video review at the end of it. I don't think I will be doing another written review, uh, just because I actually just last week I wrote a blog post about how I don't have time to do long written reviews anymore. So I'm trying to transition to video reviews primarily. So yeah, I've got a long written review of the first edition. I think I'll be doing the second edition as video review only. And I should also state what's probably already evident, but I should just state this explicitly, is that there is now a relationship of sorts between me and the author. I mean, it's not a deep correspondence, but there have been a few Twitter messages sent back and forth. He left me some very nice comments on the blog, and that can't but help affect my objectivity as a reviewer. So I'm just going to state that up front, that I'm much more kindly disposed to the author now, and that will probably affect my objectivity. And then if I forget to state that at any point in the future, that'll just hold true for any further comments I make on this book. Yeah, you know how it goes, I'm sure. I'm gonna do my best. Do my best to still be objective and calm as I see it. So yes, starting now, the second edition of the Linguistic Wars, and talk about this more during the weekly reading vlogs.